Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Measuring Success Right. This week we'll be revisiting an episode from January of 2019 between Kylan Rutherford and John Bingham. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
John Bingham joined the Marriott School in 2005 and is a Donald L. Staley Fellow. Prior to his new assignment as chair of the Management Department in the Marriott School of Business in May 2017, he taught organizational behavior and strategic human resource management courses to MBA and undergraduate students. Bingham also served as the BYU MBA program director from 2013 to 2016. Bingham has received numerous awards for his accomplishments, including the Ascendant Scholar Award from the Western Academy of Management and the Merrill J. Bateman Student Choice Faculty Award. Before coming to the Marriott School, Bingham co-founded 2 professional service ventures and worked in business development for a technology startup. He enjoys hiking, biking, river rafting, skiing, and traveling with his wife Amy and their 5 children. We welcome to the podcast, John Bingham.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you. So, one of the things that sticks out for me on your resume and on this bio, it's organizational behavior. Mm-hmm. And that just, what do you mean by that? What does organizational behavior mean to you?
Organizational behavior is the study of individuals and organizations. It has to do with the organization, teams, leaders, structure, systems, how all of these things come together to hopefully influence or in positive ways the way organizations operate. To me, it has more to do with how the human element influences what organizations do. Everything they do, from how they think about mission, how they think about strategy, how they think about the execution of strategy, and how they make money.
And so you don't just study like, oh, this happens and this is what people do. You actually look at ways that you can influence that behavior. I think one of the things that I've heard people say about your work, positive psychology. Mm-hmm. How can you influence somebody's behavior, especially in a business setting? That sounds almost like manipulation, is it?
No, not quite. We study and examine all kinds of constructs, we call them, in organizations. So, for example, if you were trying to influence in positive ways employee satisfaction, you might look at how employees get paid or how employees interact with their supervisors. And what we do as organizational behavior scholars is we measure those constructs and we look at how those things interact, and then we can empirically, using statistical models and things like that, look at relationships and test whether or not those relationships actually produce the results that managers think they produce. So oftentimes in organizations, managers go along with anecdotal information thinking that, yeah, I'm doing good things in my company. I'm making a difference. The reality is some of these questions are empirical, and we need data to support whether or not we're actually doing the right thing or not. And hopefully, organizational behavior scholars help examine the right constructs and the right interplay of different phenomena in organizations to be able to help managers understand, well, yeah, I actually am doing something right that's making a difference. And cool. I can measure it.
That's interesting. And you said something about the way employees get paid?
Mm-hmm.
For example, me, like when I get my paycheck, there are different ways to influence my behavior based on how you get that to me?
Yeah. So pay is an interesting phenomenon. It's something that we often think of as just base salary, how much I get paid per hour, or per day, or per month. Pay actually has a much broader conceptualization according to organizational behavior scholarship. We think about pay as the way that people are motivated to do what they do at work. So we have things called intrinsic motivators. These are things like recognition, responsibility, mastery, opportunities to work with really interesting people, as well as extrinsic factors or motivators. And these are things like my base salary or my hourly wage or the benefits that are provided to me, or my 401k, or other elements of my retirement. So pay is a really complicated construct in organizational behavior. It's something that we think about a lot as employees, and we as organizational behavior scholars, we get really fascinated by how pay goes beyond just the paycheck that you receive at the end of the month.
I never thought of that. Just the different ways that a company is paying me, not necessarily with money, but with...
And maybe we shouldn't call it pay for the purposes of our conversation here. Maybe we should call it incentives or inducements or motivators, because to the average everyday person walking around the street, pay is money. It's my paycheck. Okay. But to us, when we sit around and we talk about these things, we think about it in a more broad sense.
So it's more of a, academics looking at this, they would encompass that all in pay, but we don't necessarily have to call it that.
Right.
Interesting. So you're somebody who's had a lot of experience, not just as a professor teaching about these things, but actually in the business world, experiencing these principles that you write about now. What was it like being in it? Do you have any experiences? I know you worked with a media startup in the 90s. What was that like?
Yeah, it was exciting. As you can imagine, at the end of the 90s, everyone thought they were going to get rich. Everyone wanted to be a part of some .com, and so did I. And I worked with a media startup that was doing some pretty aggressive things with content and selling content as well as products. And it was exciting for a couple of years, and then it became really clear that what we were doing, even though we were making some money, our costs were very high. We were hiring a lot of people. We were taking on new projects. We were taking on a lot of headcount, and we were in a very expensive piece of real estate, providing free lunches, lots of opportunities for employees to do many different things.
Different ways of paying.
That's right, pay, right?
Yeah.
And that gets costly. And very quickly, our investors started to realize that this was not going to materialize into a profitable company. And I decided in early 2001 to make a shift and to move out of industry and into academia. And it was a perfect time to do it, it turns out. And the time I started my PhD program in August of 2001, the company that I had been working for was closing its doors.
And that wasn't necessarily anything unethical. It was just the .com bubble.
It was. There were market forces. There were economic factors. There were investor fears that drove many of those decisions. For me, it ended up being one of the greatest things that's happened in my professional life. Why? Because it led me into academia.
And what was that shift like? There's always that feeling of, you're just, you're not actually doing anything. You're just looking at stuff.
So the CEO of the company said to me when I came to him and told him that I had planned to leave the company and was going to pursue a PhD, he said, "John, why would you do that? You are a good thinker. You're a good executor. Stick around here. We're going to do something big. If you're an academic, you just theorize and talk about what managers and practitioners actually do. Why don't you want to do the stuff that academics talk about instead of just talking about or thinking about or writing about it?" But in the end, the decision to leave industry for me was certainly the best way to go. And wow, it's been a great ride the last 17 years.
So as an academic, do you feel like you've still been able to have a real impact through your research or through teaching? What does that feel like? How do you measure the actual impact you're having?
It's a good question, and I think about that a lot. Sometimes in academia, we look at how many people read our articles. We look at citation counts, which means how many people who are writing other journal articles cite my research in their papers. And sometimes you look at those data and you think, wow, I'm not really making much of a difference. But then you walk into a classroom and you share some of your research perspective and your results with a group of students who are hungry to learn. And it changes everything. They get excited. They see the passion that you have for your topic, and they get it. They understand why it's important.
And you're one of the recipients of the Merrill J. Bateman Student Choice Faculty Award, and That's not decided by your peers. That's decided completely by students, correct?
Donuts, candy, lots of inducements, pay.
Okay.
We'll get you all kinds of rewards.
Interesting. What is that, as in this pay framework, what's the difference in the impact on you, just kind of, your feeling of achievement, this student award versus maybe, a grant or an award from, fellow faculty members? What's the difference?
Well, it's certainly an honor to be recognized by the students. The students obviously are very good evaluators of the learning experience. They are the product in an academic institution, and they are hopefully the next generation of leaders. And at BYU, we think a lot about that. Certainly, it's always flattering to be recognized by your colleagues, and I've had the fortunate opportunity of receiving a couple of recognitions from the college and from our department. But there is nothing like having a group of students say, "Hey, we think you're fantastic, and you've really changed our lives."
Wow, that's awesome. Stepping back kind of towards some of the research you do, and this, kind of connects with what your students are saying. They're grateful for your impact. One of the things that you've kind of researched is the positive psychology, specifically dealing with gratitude. Could you tell me a little bit about that research and what you found?
Yeah, I think the research that I've become really interested in over the last probably 14 or 15 years has to do with the way that organizations espouse a cause or something that goes beyond just striving for financial success, although that's certainly important, and how those causes or mission or set of enduring principles, whatever you want to call it, how those things influence how much we can do to attract top talent, how well we develop that talent, and how well we can retain people within the organization and keep them engaged in what we do. This all started when I was an employee at REI. You may be familiar with the company Recreational Equipment Incorporated. Many years ago, decades ago, I worked for REI, and I went to work and I saw these guys, men and women, working for peanuts, not very much hourly pay, but they loved it. They were enthralled by the products that they were able to sell, being able to talk with people about camping gear, tents and backpacks, sleeping bags and skis, bicycles and kayaks. And I was intrigued by how much the mission of the organization to help people get outside themselves, which is REI's mantra, how much that influenced the employee experience. And ever since then, I've been interested in that phenomenon and have looked at it in a variety of different ways and how people have a positive experience at work, whether it's feeling gratitude, whether it's feeling an extension of their ability to contribute to something meaningful in the world through their work or through their connection to other people with whom they feel a strong emotional connection.
So kind of on the other side of that, you've done some research on kind of the opposite of positive psychology when people do bad things. Specifically, you've looked at why employees might do unethical things in the name of their company. What does that look like?
Sure. What's interesting about this phenomenon of unethical pro-organizational behavior is that it's actually behavior that's intended to benefit the company. In other words, it's like the positive things that an employee would be expected to do because she or he feels a strong emotional connection to the mission or cause. But that behavior happens to be unethical. So this would be things like, I really care about my supervisor, and there are some incriminating documents that are circulating about this person. I'm going to do what I can to try to protect my supervisor by shredding these documents or deleting information that could damage the reputation of my supervisor. Or, wow, we've got a bunch of products that are slightly expired, and I work for a pharmaceutical company, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the labels on these things because I know how important it is for our team to make the quota, the sales quota at the end of this quarter. And yeah, I'm changing the expiration date, but it doesn't really harm anybody explicitly because these drugs are good for years beyond their expiration date. So do you see what I'm saying? These are little things that employees rationalize and do it in the name of the company because I feel a strong connection to my supervisor, my team, or the organization I work for.
Interesting. I had a chance earlier this semester. I have a cousin who's out at Harvard Law School, and I had a chance to sit in on a law class with her. And one of the things they talked about was the professor brought up kind of a case study of, they talked about a lawyer who, I can't remember the specifics, but he put something that was essentially unethical on an advertisement for his company. And they posed the question to the class. And obviously illegal is one thing, and that's, illegal. But the question was, in that gray area of it's unethical, but not necessarily illegal, if you're pursuing the good of your company, should you do it? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting and complicated question. Sometimes we ask the question, is it unethical for this group? And if the answer is yes, we might ask, is it unethical for another group? So who is the referent group that we are evaluating when we make statements about ethical standards? To do something unethical in the United States may not be something unethical in Uganda or in Russia. And it may be perfectly legal and considered ethical. So we have to think about deviance as something that deviates from some sort of standard that is accepted by the general population against which we're making some kind of statement or evaluation. Again, if I were to go to another country and engage in certain practices that might be considered questionable in the U.S., how would others look at that? They might say, that's just doing business. There's nothing wrong with giving a bribe. That really is just a payment for service. And in the United States, we actually do those kinds of things all the time, but we just don't call them bribes. We call them payments for service. So can you see where there is a little bit of confusion about what is or is not ethical? Now, obviously, there are certain things that many people would agree are absolutely unethical. Killing someone, violating certain, global standards, human trafficking, things like that. Generally, most people would look at those things called hypernorms, which are globally accepted standards of behavior, and say, yeah, that's probably not a good thing to do. Taking somebody's child away from them is not an acceptable practice. Killing someone is not an acceptable practice. But there are also a lot of practices that there's a lot of gray area in.
Mm-hmm. In the U.S. and in the business settings that you study, what are some of the most common unethical things you see and ways you've seen companies resolve those? Maybe things that you've seen managers or professionals do to maybe not prevent but discourage or encourage ethical behaviors rather than unethical behaviors.
Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that I think organizations have today is the focus can be really emphasized around how we achieve outcomes. And if you leave people to their own devices, people are pretty creative about getting to outcomes that are rewarded. If you don't define the processes by which those outcomes are achieved, sometimes people's creativity can lead to unethical kinds of behavior. Think about the experience that we saw recently with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, that's a case where the outcomes were emphasized. Let's get new products to our customers. And that was the area of emphasis. Let's do whatever we can to get our customers to open new accounts, to open lines of credit, to accept offers for credit cards. We're going to do whatever we can to get there. And it turns out that if you incentivize those outcomes, then the processes by which people get there turn deviant. And people start to use tactics that the company never intended, but nonetheless are unethical. So I think a focus on process is really important, and for company leaders to emphasize clearly that while outcomes matter, what matters more is how we get to those outcomes, and that we do it in ways that are both productive and ethical.
So as a manager, or even as just an employee in a company, if you're looking around at your organization, and you could probably even extend this to a family or to, a social network, what are kind of the indicators, what are the cues that you've seen people use to kind of identify, okay, I'm being successful in instilling these positive behaviors? Because for example, as a supervisor, I don't necessarily know, am I incentivizing my employees in bad ways? What are some of the indicators that people can see early on to catch and be like, okay, this is going to be a problem, or maybe indicators to say, hey, I'm doing a good job?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that seems to creep up often when we look at employees beginning to engage in unethical actions are what we might call justifications. Sometimes we call them neutralization behaviors or rationalization. When employees start coming to supervisors or even their fellow colleagues within the organization and start talking about ways that they're doing things and making excuses or rationalizing the things that they do, that's a pretty good indication that there might be some questionable things going on. Because people are, by nature, usually in organizations, they want to think of themselves as moral people, as ethically minded or individuals. And so for them to be able to do that and also participate in something that would be seen socially as unacceptable, it requires a separation or a decompartmentalization of my moral self from my business self. And that often requires more than just a cognitive consideration of what am I doing and how do I overcome that dissonance, but rather it involves a verbal discussion with somebody else of some reconciliation about what it is that I'm doing and that behavior is acceptable. And isn't that something that other people in the organization are doing? And don't you think that's okay? So we're looking for ways to find normative evidence that what I'm doing is acceptable. So if you're a supervisor and you hear people talking a lot about ways that they're getting results and doing it in maybe questionable ways, but looking for justifications, I think that's a pretty good indicator that there might be something wrong with the process that you've encouraged employees to pursue to get to the outcomes that you want.
And how would you correct that? If you identify, okay, clearly there's something wrong, and again, this is putting you in the shoes of some ambiguous manager in charge of who knows, what would you do?
I think there's always a lot to be said for being open and transparent. And I think pulling somebody in and saying, will you please be open with me about how you're getting to the results that you're getting to? And what are the processes that you're using? Why are you using those processes? What are the constraints that you feel that you're under? What are the incentives that you feel are available to you to do these kinds of things? I think having one-on-one conversations with individual employees can yield tremendously rich information about the culture of an organization that is much different than sitting in a room with 10 or 12 or 50 people and saying, hey, people, are we being ethical? Are we doing things the wrong way? Are the processes by which we're getting to the outcomes unethical or deviant? And of course, everybody collectively is going to say, no, we're fine. But the one-on-one conversations where you can explore and probe, not in a investigative, accusatory way, but in a true learning and inquisitive way to understand how an organization can be improved, that can yield tremendous information about what kinds of things may be happening in the organization that are unintentional, leading to unethical outcomes.
As you're saying this, I can't help but remember you have 5 children.
That's right.
Right? How often do you use these principles in parenting?
Oh my. If only my children could act in rational and reasonable ways, the way that sometimes students and employees and adult people who I interact with, they respond. No, I think it's complicated. Children are developing a sense of how to manage these really complicated decision-making processes. They're trying to understand what parents expect of them. They want to please parents. They have a lot of complicated emotions, chemicals that are changing in their bodies. My goodness, I have 2 teenagers, and it can be challenging to try to understand the mind of a teenager. I think what's most important is to set appropriate standards in consultation with an individual, whether it's an adult or a child, and to come to a place where there's consensus on what is and what is not acceptable, and also come to some consensus on what the consequences will be if there is a breach of contract with those standards. And when there is a breach and a rule is broken, instead of getting emotional and all worked up with a child or an employee, I can simply say, we agreed on a standard and you made a choice to break the contract, and therefore consequence X gets applied. And then you're done. You don't have to rub it in. You don't have to say, my goodness, I can't believe that you chose to go in that direction. I can't believe that you hit your brother that hard. How could you do that? That is so terrible. That's not, in my view, a constructive way to parent. And I've done that. And I can tell you from my bad experiences that that does not work. Instead, setting standards, holding people accountable without emotion. And when emotions start to rise, walking away from the situation and letting everything settle down, and then coming back to it a little bit later to address the issues is, for me, the ideal way to approach conflict and breaches of contract with employees and with children.
A child breaching a contract.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
yeah.
And it's, my son, who's 14 years old, he and I developed a technology use contract. When he wanted a new device, a mobile device, to be able to communicate with his friends and interact with people at school and church and get information, we discussed it for a while and came up with some terms that we would agree on. But the terms were lengthy enough and complicated enough and important enough that we felt like it would be a good thing to write them down. And we did, and then we all signed them, my wife and I and my son, as we sat down together, and we collectively had come to these terms of agreement. And those terms now, they hang prominently on the fridge in our pantry, and we can look at them often and reflect on them and see how we're doing relative to what we agreed on initially when we bought the phone.
That's powerful. That's really smart. So, kind of in conclusion, you've talked a lot about different things that you've observed and ways that you can help other people improve. Ways you can overcome unethical behavior, ways that you can focus on the positive, and even a little bit of parenting advice. How, and this is you personally, how do you identify whether you're successful, not just in understanding, but in implementing all these things that you're observing? Do you have some indicator that says, I'm doing a good job, or, ooh, I need to fix some stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I struggle with really every day. At the end of the day, when I look back over what I've done, what I've accomplished, and how my interactions with other people have gone, I ask myself, how do I feel? Like, what's my sort of spiritual sense of calm and peace? And to what degree do I feel like I was not true to the values and principles that I hold really dear? To what degree was I disrespectful or maybe self-serving in the things that I did versus really focusing on the needs of others? The beautiful thing about being at the stage of life that I'm in is that much of what I think about these days really has to do with how I'm blessing other people's lives. And I know that might sound cheesy, but it really is about the satisfaction that I feel being able to do something that might benefit somebody else. My job as department chair in the management department is all about serving my colleagues. And I've had this feeling, if I end the day and think to myself, nobody said thank you to me for the things that I've done. Nobody acknowledged my contributions to their success as a scholar, as a teacher, as a member of this community, then I'm not in the right place. I need to be focused on doing things because I sincerely desire to help other people. And I can do that now because I've been fortunate enough to get to a place in my career where that is my focus. And so many people in my career did that for me and invested in my success and invested in me when, man, it didn't look like there was a chance for this John Bingham guy to make it in the world. And other people saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. And they took the time to mentor me and to help me. And so that's how I measure success now. As I look back and I say, did I make a difference in somebody's life? Did I do something that may have benefited somebody? And do I feel peace and calm and an assurance that I don't need to be recognized for it? That I'm not keeping track of or counting the number of times that somebody says, hey, John, you're awesome, and thanks so much for what you did. But instead, that I can go to sleep at night and say, hey, you know what? I'm good with God, and I can stand with confidence in His presence, knowing that what I've done today is what He would want me to do, and that I have made my very best efforts to be primarily a good husband and a good father, and then secondarily, a good colleague, a good professional, a good steward of the resources that are given to me at BYU, and hopefully a good contributor to the learning of my students and their lives.
Well, thank you so much for your time talking with me. I can definitely say that you've made an impact in my life today, and the handful of podcast listeners who have made it this far into the podcast, I'm sure you've impacted them as well.
Well, thanks for the time. Thanks to the listeners for getting to this point in the podcast. I hope I've said something that may be useful.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.